There is rarely a single, identifiable moment when this internal shift begins. No specific conversation, message, or event that can later be isolated as a turning point. It develops instead through a slow accumulation of small observations, minor disappointments, and repeated inconsistencies that gradually alter how a person positions themselves within a relationship and within their own emotional life. At first, nothing appears dramatic. Routines remain intact, conversations continue, and outward behavior changes very little. Yet beneath this surface continuity, attention quietly reorganizes itself around subtle signals of instability, pauses that feel slightly longer than before, responses that arrive with less tonal engagement, absences that no longer seem accidental. In everyday life, this often appears in ordinary situations. Checking a phone during a lunch break and noticing that the screen remains unchanged longer than expected, rereading a short reply and sensing that it carries less engagement than similar messages once did, or realizing that shared plans are increasingly postponed without clear explanation. Individually, none of these moments seem significant enough to justify concern. Each is easily explained through context, fatigue, external pressure, or simple distraction, allowing the overall pattern to develop quietly without provoking immediate resistance. The mind begins storing these small irregularities as background information, not yet forming explicit conclusions, but adjusting expectations, preparing for uncertainty, and lowering emotional reliance without full conscious awareness. Those in this position often notice that they begin organizing their days with slightly more independence, leaving more time uncommitted, reducing emotional anticipation, and maintaining a form of internal reserve that did not previously exist, even though they may not yet describe this change as deliberate. Rarely is this shift experienced as empowerment in its early stages. More often it appears as a subtle form of emotional caution, a quiet attempt to preserve stability by limiting exposure to unpredictable reactions and inconsistent availability. While they may still appear attentive, responsive, and engaged externally, internally they begin recalibrating how much meaning they assign to messages, gestures, and temporary displays of closeness. They learn through repetition not to invest fully in signals that have repeatedly dissolved without explanation. In practical terms, this often involves responding with slightly less urgency, sharing fewer vulnerable thoughts, postponing emotionally demanding conversations, and relying more heavily on personal routines, work, or solitary activities to regulate mood. What occurs is not emotional withdrawal in any dramatic sense, but a gradual redistribution of psychological resources away from relationship uncertainty and toward internal coherence, even though the person may not yet consciously frame it in these terms. From the outside, this process remains largely invisible. There are no confrontations, no ultimatums, and no explicit boundaries, only a slow adjustment in posture, attention, and emotional exposure. Internally, however, the nervous system is learning through repeated experience that stability cannot be assumed, that reassurance is intermittent, and that emotional equilibrium must increasingly be generated without reliable external support. As this learning accumulates, they begin relying less on emotional feedback from the relationship to regulate self-worth and mood. They turn instead to personal structure, habits, and private standards, even if these remain early and imperfect. They may notice themselves thinking more carefully before sending messages, choosing words with greater restraint, or deciding not to pursue clarification in situations where previous attempts produced ambiguity rather than resolution. At the same time, they often experience internal contradiction, one part still seeking closeness, reassurance, and emotional confirmation, while another part has already begun preparing for distance and autonomy. Attachment and self-protection coexist, creating a persistent internal tension, managed through restraint rather than confrontation, through silence rather than argument, through adaptation rather than direct negotiation. Identity begins reorganizing around this new internal position, where emotional safety is sought less through relationship stability and more through personal predictability, routine, and self-regulation. Those in this phase often describe feeling calmer on the surface, while simultaneously feeling less emotionally open, less spontaneous, and more controlled in their interactions. even though they may not yet understand why this shift is occurring. What has changed is not their capacity for care, empathy, or connection, but their willingness to place these capacities in environments that have repeatedly failed to provide consistency. The shift reflects an early form of self-governance, in which behavior begins aligning more closely with observed patterns than with verbal assurances, hopes, or past memories. Instead of reacting immediately to uncertainty, they begin observing it, registering it, and adjusting quietly. Experience rather than expectation guides emotional investment. A more stable internal reference point emerges, one that depends less on external validation and more on internal standards of coherence, reciprocity, and reliability. However, this internal reference point remains fragile. It has not yet been tested under conditions of strong emotional activation, loneliness, fatigue, or renewed contact. It exists primarily as a cognitive and behavioral adjustment rather than as a physical capacity capable of consistently regulating emotional impulses during periods of vulnerability. The fragility becomes especially evident when familiar patterns reappear, when distance is followed by sudden attention, when absence is interrupted by unexpected messages, or when emotional availability briefly returns. In those moments, the emerging internal structure is challenged. The person is forced to confront the gap between what has been learned intellectually and what the nervous system continues to expect emotionally. The tension signals a transition into a deeper phase of self-regulation, in which internal posture must be supported not only by reflection and intention, but by the capacity to remain stable in the presence of physical sensations, emotional memory, and automatic attachment responses. To understand this requires moving beyond abstract concepts of boundaries and self-respect and toward close observation of how uncertainty, anticipation, and restraint are experienced in the body, in attention, and in everyday behavior. When emotional uncertainty becomes a recurring feature of daily life, its first consistent impact is rarely cognitive or philosophical, but physiological, appearing quietly through altered breathing patterns, subtle muscle tension, and changes in baseline alertness that most recognize only after they have been present for extended periods. In ordinary situations, sitting at a desk, waiting in line, lying in bed before sleep, or walking through familiar streets, the body begins to maintain a low level of readiness, as if anticipating interruption, evaluation, or sudden emotional demand, even when no immediate stimulus is present. This readiness often expresses itself through slightly elevated heart rate, shallow or irregular breathing, tightened shoulders, a clenched jaw, and a persistent sense of internal restlessness that makes stillness uncomfortable and relaxation incomplete. Many notice that they check their phones more frequently without clear intention, not because they expect a specific message, but because the nervous system has learned to associate digital signals with emotional regulation. Notifications function as temporary markers of safety or relevance. When the screen remains silent, the body does not experience neutrality, but mild destabilization, producing sensations similar to boredom, unease, or diffuse anxiety, even in objectively calm environments. These small reactions accumulate, forming a background state of heightened sensitivity in which attention is easily drawn toward potential emotional cues, such as message previews, changes in tone, or gaps in communication. At night, when external stimulation decreases, this physiological pattern often becomes more apparent. Thoughts circulate more rapidly, sleep becomes lighter and more fragmented, and the body remains partially alert even in the absence of immediate concerns. Those in this phase may experience difficulty falling asleep, frequent waking, or early morning rumination, not because of specific worries, but because the nervous system has adapted to uncertainty as a default condition. During the day, similar patterns appear in concentration and energy levels. Periods of mental fatigue, reduced focus, and occasional irritability emerge without clear external causes. These changes are not indicators of weakness or emotional instability, but predictable consequences of prolonged exposure to inconsistent relationship signals which require continuous low-level monitoring and interpretation. Physiologically, this monitoring engages stress regulation systems designed for short-term challenges, rather than for extended periods of ambiguous activation. The result is gradual depletion of emotional and physical resources. In practical terms, this may appear as frequent sighing, habitual posture adjustments, jaw tension, digestive discomfort, headaches, or a persistent sense of being on edge, even during routine activities. At the same time, moments of temporary reconnection, reassurance, or emotional warmth often produce immediate bodily relief, deeper breathing, muscle relaxation, and a brief return to calm. The association between external contact and internal regulation strengthens. Because this relief is short-lived, the nervous system becomes increasingly sensitive to fluctuations, amplifying reactions to both presence and absence and strengthening dependence on external cues. Emotional regulation shifts away from internal processes and becomes partially outsourced to relationship feedback, even when someone consciously values independence and self-control. This outsourcing is rarely recognized while it is occurring because it operates below reflective awareness, through conditioned bodily responses rather than deliberate, conscious choice. Mood may shift rapidly in response to small relationship events, delayed replies, ambiguous messages, or cancelled plans, producing physical reactions that are disproportionate to the apparent significance of the trigger. Sudden drops in energy, tightness in the chest, or waves of restlessness may appear that seem difficult to explain logically, yet follow a consistent internal pattern. The reactions reflect a nervous system that has learned to treat relationship uncertainty as a meaningful threat to stability, activating protective mechanisms even in the absence of immediate danger. This state does not remain constant. It fluctuates according to context, fatigue, workload, and social environment, becoming more pronounced during periods of stress, isolation, or emotional vulnerability. So on days when someone feels rested, supported, and engaged in meaningful activity, these bodily responses may recede into the background, creating the impression that the issue has resolved. However, when energy is low or distractions are limited, the same patterns tend to resurface quickly, revealing that the underlying regulatory system has not yet been recalibrated. Many find that periods of solitude, illness, late-night quiet, or professional pressure often reactivate emotional sensitivity, even after intervals of apparent stability. Some begin to notice this connection between relationship dynamics and physical state, recognizing that their body responds before conscious interpretation occurs. They may become aware that tension appears before worry is articulated, that restlessness precedes emotional narratives, and that physiological discomfort often arrives before identifiable thoughts. Attention shifts from external behavior alone to the internal processes that sustain attachment patterns. It becomes possible to observe how physical sensations, emotional memory, and automatic reactions interact to maintain relationship engagement even when rational evaluation suggests disengagement. When relationship uncertainty becomes normalized across months or years, its most significant consequences are rarely concentrated in a single crisis or visible collapse. They are distributed across daily life in small, continuous expenditures of attention, energy, and psychological capacity that accumulate quietly. In practical terms, this often begins with minor adjustments that appear reasonable in isolation, delaying personal plans to remain available, postponing decisions until emotional conditions seem clearer, or keeping schedules flexible in anticipation of uncertain communication. Each of these choices seems temporary and reversible. Together, however, they establish a pattern in which personal priorities are repeatedly reorganized around unstable dynamics, reducing autonomy without explicit agreement. One of the earliest costs appears in attention. Increasing portions of mental focus become dedicated to monitoring tone, timing, responsiveness, and subtle changes in interaction, leaving less space for sustained concentration on work, learning, creative activity, and long-term projects. This cognitive redistribution is rarely noticed while it is occurring, because it is embedded in routine behaviors, such as rereading messages, mentally rehearsing conversations, and reviewing past interactions in search of explanatory patterns. Alongside this shift in attention comes a steady expenditure of emotional energy produced by cycles of anticipation, disappointment, hope, and adjustment that require continuous internal regulation, even in the absence of overt conflict. The regulation becomes fatiguing, contributing to low-level exhaustion that is difficult to attribute to any single cause, yet consistently correlates with periods of heightened relationship ambiguity. Another cost appears in time, not only in hours spent waiting, thinking, or recovering emotionally, but also in delayed life decisions, postponed transitions, and missed opportunities that are quietly set aside in order to preserve closeness to the relationship. Many recognize in retrospect that entire seasons of life were organized around uncertainty. Professional moves, relocations, educational plans, and personal goals were softened or deferred because emotional conditions felt unstable. A more subtle but enduring cost involves self-trust. Repeated exposure to inconsistent behavior encourages reinterpretation of discomfort, rationalization of imbalance, and gradual erosion of confidence in one's own perceptions. Each time an intuition is dismissed, a concern is minimized, or a boundary is postponed, the internal reference system becomes less reliable. Dependence on external cues for validation increases. Social relationships are affected as emotional investment becomes concentrated around a single unstable dynamic, reducing availability for friendships, family connections, and broader social engagement. Conversations with others may become filtered, selective, or incomplete, shaped by the need to protect a fragile narrative rather than reflect lived experience accurately. Physically, prolonged uncertainty often corresponds with disrupted sleep, irregular appetite, chronic muscle tension, and fluctuating energy levels, not as acute symptoms, but as persistent background conditions that slowly alter baseline functioning. Creativity and curiosity frequently decline under these conditions. Mental resources are absorbed by monitoring and regulation rather than exploration and experimentation. Some notice that they become more cautious, less spontaneous, and more hesitant to take constructive risks. They prefer predictability over growth because emotional volatility has reduced tolerance for additional uncertainty. Another cumulative cost involves emotional flexibility. Repeated adaptation to unpredictable dynamics encourages lowering expectations, adjusting standards, and reshaping needs to fit unstable contexts. What initially appears as maturity and patience becomes a form of self-limitation, narrowing the range of acceptable treatment and redefining imbalance as normal. There is also a cost to identity. Prolonged participation in ambiguous systems encourages self-definition through responsiveness, accommodation, and emotional labor, rather than through coherent values and independent priorities. Someone may struggle to distinguish between authentic preferences and learned adaptations, between genuine desire and habitual compromise. These changes rarely provoke alarm because they occur incrementally through small adjustments that appear reasonable and responsible in isolation, even as their cumulative effect becomes substantial. Because no single sacrifice feels decisive, the total investment often remains unexamined. Costs continue accumulating without conscious accounting. Many recognize the magnitude of this investment only after distance has been established, when they begin noticing how much time, energy, and attention become available once constant monitoring and adjustment cease. At that point, previously normalized exhaustion, distraction, and emotional depletion become visible as consequences rather than as personal shortcomings. The retrospective clarity often brings both relief and discomfort, as someone confronts how much of their internal life was organized around maintaining an unstable equilibrium. The recognition does not imply fault or weakness. It reflects predictable human tendencies to prioritize immediate emotional stability over long-term health when feedback is intermittent and consequences are delayed. When the accumulated costs of prolonged emotional uncertainty are examined structurally rather than personally, what emerges is not a story of incompatibility or misfortune, but a repeatable interaction system governed by predictable inputs, automatic interpretations, and reinforced behavioral responses. At the center is a feedback loop in which inconsistent availability produces heightened attention. Heightened attention produces compensatory effort, and compensatory effort reduces the immediate consequences of withdrawal, thereby stabilizing the very behavior that generates instability. In practical terms, this loop begins when emotional presence becomes irregular, not through explicit rejection, but through delayed replies, vague commitments, partial engagement, and fluctuating responsiveness that introduce ambiguity without requiring explanation. The ambiguity functions as a regulator, allowing distance to be created without accountability and access to be preserved without consistency. It maintains flexibility for one side while transferring emotional labor to the other. As uncertainty increases, the more invested partner instinctively increases effort, offering additional availability, patience, reassurance, and interpretive work in an attempt to restore coherence to the interaction. This response is rarely strategic or manipulative. It reflects automatic threat regulation processes in which proximity and engagement are used to reduce perceived instability. The immediate effect of this increased effort is temporary emotional stabilization, reinforcing the belief that adaptation is effective and necessary. At the same time, withdrawal is rewarded with continued access and reduced pressure, reinforcing disengagement as a low-cost coping strategy. Through repetition, both participants learn that their respective behaviors function, one by preserving internal calm, the other by preserving relationship contact, even though the overall system remains imbalanced. Cognitively, this pattern is sustained through attribution biases, in which inconsistency is explained as circumstantial, temporary, or unintentional, while emotional requests are interpreted as excessive, sensitive, or unnecessary. Memory processes further strengthen the structure. Moments of closeness are disproportionately emphasized in the more engaged partner's recall, while moments of discomfort are minimized, creating an internally coherent but externally inaccurate narrative. Parallel narratives develop, allowing both to feel justified in their positions while avoiding direct confrontation with the imbalance. Another stabilizing mechanism involves intermittent reinforcement, in which unpredictable episodes of warmth, attention, or reassurance are distributed among longer periods of emotional distance. This irregular reward pattern amplifies attachment, increases focus, and sustains engagement by activating learning systems that associate persistence with occasional relief. Apologies and expressions of regret, when they appear, often function as system resets rather than indicators of durable change. They emerge when access is threatened and recede once stability is restored. These statements reduce immediate tension without altering behavioral structure, allowing cycles to resume with minimal adjustment. Boundary testing also operates progressively, beginning with minor deviations and escalating as tolerance is demonstrated through continued participation. Each unchallenged inconsistency recalibrates expectations, teaching the system that imbalance carries limited long-term cost. Resistance is further discouraged through subtle invalidation, reframing, and minimization. Discomfort is labeled as oversensitivity. Clarity is framed as rigidity, and adaptation is portrayed as maturity. These responses discourage recalibration and reinforce the idea that stability depends on continued flexibility rather than mutual responsibility. Emotional regulation becomes partially outsourced, with one person's empathy, restraint, and interpretive labor compensating for the other's avoidance, ambivalence, or inconsistency. The invisible regulatory work sustains the system while remaining largely unrecognized. When this compensatory labor decreases even slightly, the system destabilizes, revealing how dependent equilibrium had become on unilateral adaptation. What had been interpreted as compatibility is exposed as imbalance in structure, maintained through efficiency rather than intention. Seen from this perspective, the dynamic persists not because of hostility or conscious manipulation, but because it minimizes effort for one side while maximizing tolerance on the other, producing a stable yet unhealthy equilibrium. It is usually in ordinary, unremarkable moments that these dynamics become visible, not during confrontations or dramatic conversations, but in small daily situations where no explicit decision is being made and direction is quietly set. You are sitting at a desk late in the afternoon, finishing a task that requires moderate attention, when you notice that you have checked your phone 3 times in 10 minutes without receiving any new message. Each glance is motivated less by expectation than by habit formed through months of intermittent responsiveness. The screen remains unchanged, yet your posture shifts slightly each time, shoulders tightening, breathing becoming shallower, and attention fragmenting as part of your awareness remains oriented toward the possibility of contact rather than fully engaged with what is in front of you. Earlier that day, you sent a brief message that required no emotional effort and no strategic framing, something practical or casual. Hours later, it remains unanswered, creating a low-level sense of incompletion that quietly occupies mental space. You begin reconstructing possible explanations, mentally reviewing schedules, obligations, stress levels, and recent conversations, assembling a narrative that preserves coherence even in the absence of evidence. When a reply finally arrives, it is brief, neutral, and detached from the original context, offering neither acknowledgement of the delay nor indication of renewed engagement. Yet you respond promptly, adjusting tone and pacing to re-establish conversational flow. Later, during a conversation in person or on a call, you notice small discontinuities that you register but do not address: delayed reactions, partial attention, or frequent glances toward another screen. Each instance is minor enough to dismiss yet consistent enough to form a pattern. You continue speaking, modifying your delivery unconsciously, shortening explanations, softening emotional language, and avoiding topics that previously seemed to produce withdrawal. Expression gradually reshapes itself around anticipated reactions. At some point, you mention feeling tired or distracted, not as a complaint, but as a factual observation. The response is a brief reassurance, followed by a change of subject, signaling closure without resolution. In social settings, you find yourself monitoring proximity, timing, and availability, waiting for cues before initiating interaction, and calibrating engagement based on fluctuating responsiveness rather than stable expectation. Plans are discussed in tentative language, framed as possibilities rather than commitments. When changes occur at short notice, you respond with flexibility that is publicly reasonable and privately draining. In quiet moments, while commuting or preparing meals, fragments of unfinished conversations return automatically, prompting internal rehearsals of alternative phrasing, hypothetical clarifications, and imagined responses that will never be delivered. When you consider raising a concern, you often delay, waiting for a more suitable moment that never arrives because previous attempts were met with minimization, distraction, or emotional withdrawal. You become increasingly skilled at detecting subtle shifts in tone, punctuation, response speed, and availability, using these signals as informal indicators of relationship stability. The vigilance operates continuously, consuming attention even when nothing is overtly wrong, creating a background layer of monitoring that becomes normalized. When friends ask how things are going, you answer in general terms, emphasizing positive moments and downplaying inconsistencies, partly to avoid external judgment and partly to preserve your own narrative of progress. At night before sleeping, you sometimes review the day's interactions, searching for reassurance in minor details while dismissing broader patterns that indicate imbalance. None of these moments feels decisive, harmful, or dramatic in isolation. Together, however, they form a consistent operational environment in which uncertainty becomes routine and adaptation becomes automatic. The structure of the relationship is not maintained through explicit agreement, but through thousands of small adjustments that accumulate into a stable pattern of unequal emotional regulation. A quiet contradiction begins to emerge between what you have been telling yourself about these experiences and what their accumulated structure reveals when examined without emotional protection or habitual justification. For a long time, you interpreted patience as maturity, flexibility as intelligence, emotional restraint as strength, and endurance as evidence of personal depth. These interpretations allowed you to remain functional within an environment that rarely offered consistent reciprocity. Within this framework, adapting to inconsistency appeared reasonable. Absorbing discomfort seemed virtuous, and postponing boundaries felt responsible, especially when compared to social narratives that portray emotional expression as weakness and distance as sophistication. You learned implicitly and repeatedly that the person who requires less appears more stable, that the person who waits appears more loyal, and that the person who tolerates ambiguity appears more evolved, even when this posture is achieved through continuous self-suppression. The moralization of endurance transformed imbalance in the relationship into a personal test of character, reframing instability as an opportunity for self-improvement rather than as information about misalignment. Each instance of waiting, adapting, or minimizing was quietly recorded as proof of emotional competence, reinforcing the belief that strength consists in remaining unaffected rather than in remaining aligned. From this perspective, moments of discomfort were interpreted as personal failures of regulation, rather than as signals that the environment itself was incompatible with sustainable psychological stability. You invested increasing effort in refining your reactions, moderating your tone, adjusting your expectations, and regulating emotional expression while leaving the underlying structure unchanged. A paradox emerged in which you became more disciplined internally while remaining embedded in an unstable external dynamic, producing the appearance of growth without the substance of real improvement. Stoic philosophy does not equate virtue with endurance of dysfunction, nor does it define resilience as passive tolerance of misalignment. It defines resilience as the capacity to act consistently with reason, clarity, and self-respect, regardless of emotional pressure. Discipline in this sense is not the suppression of discomfort, but the refusal to organize one's life around conditions that systematically undermine internal coherence. Yet this distinction is rarely taught explicitly. Without it, restraint easily becomes self-erasure and composure becomes complicity. You were encouraged, through cultural narratives and interpersonal feedback, to equate calmness with absence of needs, stability with emotional minimalism, and wisdom with detachment, even when these qualities were achieved through avoidance rather than regulation. As long as you remained quiet, flexible, and available, the system functioned smoothly, and this functional appearance reinforced the belief that your posture was correct. When you considered asserting limits or requesting clarity, internal resistance appeared immediately, framed as selfishness, rigidity, or emotional immaturity, discouraging recalibration before it could occur. You began to interpret self-protection as overreaction and self-advocacy as disruption, internalizing standards that favored preservation of harmony over preservation of integrity. The inversion distorted ethical evaluation, making tolerance of instability appear admirable and the requirement of consistency appear questionable. From a Stoic standpoint, this reflects a misalignment between judgment and action, in which rational recognition of imbalance is overridden by emotional habits and social conditioning. You understood at some level that the situation was unsustainable, yet continued participating because endurance had become part of your identity. The more you invested in being reasonable, the more difficult it became to acknowledge that reason itself was being compromised. The internal contradiction often surfaced in moments of quiet reflection, when you recognized the gap between what you would advise a friend in the same position and what you accepted for yourself. You could clearly articulate the importance of boundaries, reciprocity, and clarity in theory, while simultaneously postponing their application in practice. The discrepancy generated subtle cognitive strain, requiring ongoing rationalization to maintain coherence between values and behavior. Rationalization became automatic, supplying explanations before conscious evaluation could intervene. You told yourself that circumstances were temporary, that change was imminent, that understanding was preferable to conflict, and that patience would eventually be rewarded. These narratives reduced immediate discomfort while preserving long-term instability. The contradiction, therefore, did not appear as confusion, but as overconfidence in one's capacity to endure without cost. You came to believe that discipline consisted in tolerating more rather than in choosing better. Only gradually did it become apparent that this interpretation was incompatible with sustainable self-governance. True Stoic stability does not require continuous sacrifice of internal order in exchange for external peace. It requires alignment between perception, judgment, and action, maintained consistently across contexts. When this alignment is absent, composure becomes performative and restraint becomes strategic rather than principled. Recognizing this does not immediately dissolve old habits, but it creates a fracture in the narrative that once justified them. It becomes increasingly difficult to describe accommodation as virtue when its cumulative effects are clearly destabilizing. It becomes harder to frame silence as wisdom when it functions primarily as avoidance of necessary recalibration. And it becomes impossible to continue equating endurance with maturity once its psychological cost becomes fully visible. The shift moves from moralized patience to clearer judgment about what the relationship structure actually is, from emotional management to regulation based on values. What ultimately remains, after interpretation, analysis, reframing, and protocol have been integrated into daily conduct, is not a new identity, a new narrative, or a new emotional posture, but a quieter and more stable internal configuration that no longer depends on external fluctuation to maintain coherence. You do not experience this configuration as confidence, detachment, or emotional strength in any performative sense, because it does not announce itself and does not require reinforcement through comparison, validation, or recognition. It expresses itself through the absence of internal turbulence in situations that once generated disproportionate psychological activation, through the lack of urgency in moments that previously demanded immediate emotional response, and through the disappearance of internal negotiations that once consumed attention. The need to monitor tone, timing, availability, and intention recedes, replaced by a default orientation toward consistency, reciprocity, and clarity that operates without continuous effort. You no longer construct explanations for instability, reinterpret ambiguity as depth, or invest energy in decoding behavior that has already demonstrated its limitations. Attention is directed outward toward work, learning, relationships, and responsibilities that reinforce internal order, rather than inward, toward unresolved relationship dynamics. Emotional memory remains accessible without becoming directive. Past experiences are retained as reference material rather than as templates for future behavior. Regret, nostalgia, and hypothetical alternatives no longer organize present decisions. Evaluation is anchored in accumulated evidence rather than imagined outcomes. The internal environment becomes predictable, not in the sense of rigidity, but in the sense of reliability, allowing energy to be allocated without constant recalibration. This predictability supports long-term projects, sustained focus, and deeper engagement with areas of life that were previously fragmented by emotional preoccupation. You remain capable of care, attachment, and vulnerability, but these capacities are exercised selectively within structures that demonstrate mutual responsibility and psychological stability. You do not avoid complexity, you avoid instability. You do not suppress feeling. You regulate exposure, you do not withdraw from connection. You withdraw from incoherence. Identity is no longer negotiated through reaction, endurance, or accommodation, but maintained through alignment between judgment, behavior, and environment. There is no need to defend this position, explain it, or justify it, because it functions without requiring endorsement. It is sustained through ordinary conduct, through consistency, through judgment, through self-respect maintained in how life is structured. And within this maintained order, life proceeds without dramatic resolution, without symbolic closure, and without narrative finality, guided instead by an internal system that remains open to refinement while no longer vulnerable to cycles that once defined its movement.